Now we might address ourselves to what is really in many ways the much more interesting dimension of what might be called the vertical source or the vertically related source of the original Gnostic tradition. Now, all the Gnostic sources that refer to the subject state that the Gnostic tradition was always in the world, and that its principal teachers were certain patriarchs and prophets of the Bible. At a certain point, especially in the Manichaean sources, we find representatives of the tradition, messengers of light, among whom Buddha and Zarathustra are mentioned prominently. The Nag Hammadi scriptures give eloquent testimony to this. Particularly informative in this regard are the Apocryphon of John, on the origin of the world, the testimony of truth, the hypostasis of the archons, the thought of Norea, the apocalypse of Adam. Why? Because they indicate that Gnosis and the workings of Gnosis were present already in paradise, in the garden. Sophia is there, who influences Eve, because Eve is the intuitive one who listens to Sophia. Adam is like men so often are, sort of a clod, and it takes quite a bit to get him to understand something. A bit of a dummy. So it is Eve who awakens Adam to Gnosis from the deep sleep of unconsciousness. I have a wonderful quotation, but I won't use that one now. It can be found in Nag Hammadi. In the Apocalypse of Adam, for instance, says that Eve taught Adam the word of the Gnosis of the eternal God. Adam's and Eve's children, not the two who bumped each other off and gave brotherhood a bad name. Whenever I hear that, brotherhood, universal brotherhood, then I usually say, isn't the behavior of the first two brothers that you read about in Genesis, if that's an indication how brothers treat each other, you know what? Forget brotherhood, call it something else. I don't know, maybe universal cousinhood, or niecehood and nephewhood, but forget the brotherhood, because that Cain and Abel business is really a pretty bad example, very bad example. But there are others. Seth, the third son, that's the Gnostic son. And then there is also a daughter of Eve called Norea. And Norea tries to frustrate the plans of the demiurge, for instance, with the ark, because she breathes upon it and burns it up. So she has a sort of a dragon breath. I don't know, but pretty powerful lady. And she escapes from the archons who try to go after her and as a punishment try to rape her. And the great angel Eleret comes and rescues her. And Gnostics are referred to most frequently thereafter as the great race of Seth. Race, of course, here meaning a spiritual descent rather than a descent of bloodline. We, of course, have also a whole biblical counter-history. The Gnostics forever struggle against the demiurge and his hosts who persecutes them. The great flood and the fiery destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah are part of that. And the prophecy is made by Adam to his son Seth in the Apocalypse of Adam in Nag Hammadi, saying that his descendants, his spiritual descendants, we might interpret, the Noahs, would endure in spite of all the adversities and persecutions until a time of gnosis and liberation of great magnitude would dawn after the coming of the, what in Greek is, in Coptic is called the Phoster. Now, Phos means light. Phoster means the illuminator, man of light. Possibly Jesus, maybe also Mani. Now, what does this mean? All right, let me just kind of jump back a little bit and add my own three characteristics to the common traits to the ones that Marvin Mayer mentions. I would say here are 3 important common traits. Number 1, all schools of Gnosis claim to originate in the experience of Gnosis. I don't think Marvin Mayer would disagree. Number 2, all schools of Gnosis hold that only Gnosis is salvific. Now this is important to remember. It's frequently glossed over. Look at the various forms of Christianity. Salvation by faith. Faith in what? Faith in the death of Jesus. Which in turn is tied in with what is often called atonement theology, which has to do with the notion that at a certain point, after all the business with the apple, if indeed it was an apple, in the garden, God gets angry. He gets angry and stays angry for a heck of a long time, and he can only unbecome angry, shall we say, by having his own son nailed to a great big cross and die in tremendous agony. Weird folks. And then they call the Gnostics weird. The Gnostics have weird theories. Just look at that one. And then by believing in that horrific situation, you will be saved from original sin, all kinds of other sin, and its consequences. Equally weird. The Gnostic tradition cuts across all of that and says, no, you can believe what you want or what you don't want. You can even do what you want or you don't want, but none of that is going to truly get you back to the divine. None. Only Gnosis will. Why? Because Gnosis is an intimate, personal, immediate reconnection of the human with the divine. When that connection reappears, there you are. But not believing in this, believing in that, following this commandment, following that commandment. And third, all schools of Gnosis hold that there is an intermediate reality, an intermediate power, which in some Gnostic scriptures is identified as the demiurge by the Platonic word, meaning that there is a power, a field of consciousness, or a person, whichever way you want to look at it, that is interposed, that sort of interposed itself between ourselves and the divine, and that the power and the fascination and the tyranny of which has to be overcome if we are to be enlightened, if we are to have Gnosis. Those are the 3 that I would add to the ones by Marvin Mayer. Now, once again, we can ask ourselves a little bit as to what does all this mean. Well, I think first it may mean pretty much what it says. There are those who have Gnosis, and they also usually have the power to help others to have Gnosis. Such are the awakeners, the liberators, and people of the light. They have always been here, and they are never absent. There are different categories, or you might sizes, of such illuminators. Some are aeonial beings, some are illumined humans. This in turn is, how should I put it, counterbalanced by another factor, which indicates that we human beings have the capacity for the interior experience of Gnosis, and that we as human beings possess this capacity, well, at any given time in unequal measure. That is why some people become enlightened and some people don't. But going back to what we said earlier, so there is a balance. We have the capacity for Gnosis, but this capacity can be and indeed should be stimulated, should be awakened, should be strengthened by the messengership of the light. So it's not entirely a matter of pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It's not a totally individual and personal matter, and that of course bothers the modern and the postmodern mind, which has become tremendously alienated from certain realities and also terribly arrogant. It's sort of like that. You probably don't, most of you don't remember that on the television screen where there was a particular advertisement that said, "Mother, I'd rather do it myself." Well, okay, it's okay to want to do it yourself, but you can't quite do it yourself. You do require help. And I think the way to make it really in almost any endeavor, even here in the world, is to know when to accept help. If you're so doggone proud or shy or whatever that you never accept help from anybody, you're not going to get very far. And you also got to keep in mind that by allowing other people to help you, you facilitate their powers of compassion and of kindness and so forth. So by being open to help, we actually help those who help us. And there also has to be, no, don't do anything to me, don't. No, I don't want anything. No. Well, you not only hurt yourself, but you actually hurt the spiritual welfare of others, which is very different from being clinging on to others and wanting other people to always do things for you. But you have to know how to accept. So this is the balance between your own capacity and the help that you receive and that you should receive. Now, of course, I think there's very little doubt that at any given time, let's say, the practical ability of people to become enlightened, to use the Buddhist term, or to have gnosis is unequal. Why was there only one Buddha 2,500 years ago or something? Why was there only one Buddha, Gautama, at that time? Why didn't thousands and thousands of people in India become Buddhas? They all have the Buddha nature, they all have the capacity, but they didn't. They didn't. Because they were not capable at that particular time. They had to avail themselves of the help, and so it is generally. That's why the Gnostics spoke of Heletics and Psychics and Pneumatics. The Heletics being people of a material-oriented consciousness, the Psychics being of a mind-oriented consciousness, and the Pneumatics of a spirit-oriented consciousness. And of these, the Heletic, the materialistic person, is regarded as the least promising. And this is, of course, the kind of person to whom only the physical is real. Everything else, if it is anything at all, is sort of constellated around the physical. We might even say there is gross materialism and there is subtle materialism. Much of contemporary thinking is in the nature of subtle materialism. We have neurologically or brain-oriented psychiatry. Everything is in here. Or we have economically oriented sociology, for instance, and political theory. Everything that happens is due to economic forces, economic conditions. That was really Marxist thesis, but there are a lot of people who would never own up to being Marxists who have that. Everything goes back to economics, which really means goes back to money. Now, if that's not materialism, I don't know what is. Also, when science is conceived as purely the knowledge of physical forces, well, all of this is the sort of thing that the late Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche called spiritual materialism. So, one has to break through that in order to come to gnosis. There's no doubt about it. As long as that prevails, you're not going anywhere. Now there is the second one is the psychic, and that's not your friendly neighborhood psychic on the corner who will read your palms or things like that, a frequent California phenomenon in some fashion or the other, but it is the person who values and overvalues things of the mind. an enormous amount of this is present also in today's world. We worship our ideas, our opinions, and our concepts. The result, of course, is a very closed mindset that will not admit gnosis. One has to sort of come to a recognition that, very difficult thing to admit, that our ideas might be wrong. That our ideas might be wrong. That a lot of our ideas are unreal. They don't have any validity or any substance. The Buddhists, of course, who are very outspoken about these matters, the Buddhists say every human being until he or she attains enlightenment is deluded, lives in a state of delusion. And that is why that deluded mind should not be listened to, because the objections that you raise to the process of enlightenment come out of your deluded mind. So how could it be valid? There's something to be said for that. They are not very diplomatic the way they put it, but it just could be right. So you might say the heretic believes what he sees. The psychic sees what he believes. The psychic sees what he believes. There's this new age saying of creating your own reality. Oh yeah, you do create it, and you know what? When you created it, you don't like it all that much, do you? And moreover, you also try to create it for others, and that's pretty bad. But the psychic has possibilities. When his thinking changes, he may be able to become pneumatic. So there is the possibility of change there. So the psychic may let go of his psychic obsessions and get ready for gnosis. And then, of course, the pneumatic has the experiences and continues to evaluate them, to amplify them, to process them. Because gnosis needs to be understood as an ongoing process. So in summing up the portion of our questioning, let us state that once more, that Gnosticism is the tradition of spirituality that expresses a specific interior experience of a liberating and revelatory character. It's a long sentence, but I think it's not bad. Gnosticism is the cup, as it were, that is uniquely suited to contain the essence of the experience of gnosis. However, this is not all. Gnosticism, or as it might be called the Gnostic tradition, is not only a container, but it is also an amplifying and assimilative vehicle of the experience of gnosis, and thus an effective facilitator of further experiences of the same nature. So, I'll conclude with this pretty much with where we started. Just like there is scripture and tradition. In the gnosis, of course, we have scriptures also, but there is experience and tradition. And I am convinced that the Gnostic tradition, written down or not, is the best expression on the one hand, and also the best road to gnosis. Why? Because it has been devised by people who had gnosis. It is the result, the outcome of high transcendental forms of altered states of consciousness. And when there is a worldview, when there is a tradition that originates in that kind of experience, then the tradition is affinitized to the experience. And they sort of feed each other, they amplify each other, they stimulate each other. And that's the reason why, to the limits of my possibility and ability, I am a Gnostic. And that is why perhaps some of you are also, whether you know it or not, and I hope that you will know it sooner rather than later. So thank you very much.
Copyright MND.